screen.
Okay. Do that.
How do you want it?
Okay.
But I thought,
I'm worried with the
he
developer.
gave me a little hint that, I wouldn't mind that. I think I would like something like this one day. I'm like, well, how about one day being closer to now?
I got some land that is actually about to happen, come quick, that's gonna be a rental property at first until he gets some zoning done, but he'll probably sell the property
He
off.
wants it to be more like a farm for himself.
Is he a farmer?
No, he's not gonna be like,
I just need someone to get this hay all done up so they can get off this, you know, hay's get pretty high, is someone gonna get the hay?
I don't believe he's a farmer.
But no, I'll message you, I know you got your appointment now, so
Yeah.
I'll message you and we'll,
Okay.
yeah, I got it. It'll be come out, it'll be,
Just keep me in mind.
yep, it'll be soon.
Dan, I wanna know what you can do Survivor this year, everyone.
You know what? It started off real shit,
Yeah,
because people just whining, bitching and moaning,
yeah,
and then they picked up. You know, they had to get, you have to be diverse and let everybody and be included, you know, which is fine. They didn't do it for the personalities. This time they did it, I think, just to include a lot of different everythings.
yeah,
The second episode that just happened yesterday was so much better than the first.
okay,
Because it actually came back and it was actually like, okay, these people are actually just real people. They're not trying to put on a show to be on TV. And that's the way it came across on the first episode, where these people now. So yesterday was actually, it was kind of one of those, not anticlimactic episodes, but it was actually a pretty good one that you get a little more deep into the people that are on
I've
it.
never watched it ever, so I don't really know the background of it. I read somewhere that someone who didn't know how to climb a ladder. So I was like,
He was,
"Climb or not have a ladder."
he was just basically, he's just a young guy just out of shape. And had to swim in his full clothes, because you have to jump off the ship or whatever, and you have to get up out of the water and climb up this ladder. And he just physically was just not strong enough to pull himself up out of the water, that's all it was. He was not like,
I was like, I can't even wrap my brain around how that's a thing.
no, the ladder, you know, like you're in the water, floating, the ladder's up kind of high, so you have to kind of pull yourself up, and he just was exhausted, couldn't do it.
Okay, that is more fair.
Yes,
I was like, I feel like we're all born with the understanding of how to accomplish that.
exactly, they fucking do it. Jeez.
Okay, good, how about yours? Good, good. Running the bell?
No, I can't.
What is that?
An hour.
Fun for like a vacation or?
No. Got a fire.
Oh, that's nice. Good.
Tracy goes, that one's your girlfriend. I think that's a work wife, not a girlfriend, get straight.
What for name?
Exactly.
You're about to call.
She would have been if she was here, she's not, she's like my ex-work wife, because she's not here.
I'm gonna tell you said that.
Yeah, she's my
Stir
ex-work
up
wife.
the drama.
Yes, my ex-work wife
I'm
got
gonna
it.
post on Facebook for everyone to say.
I traded in her box. That's recorded, didn't it?
You deserve it after stirring up the pot for so many people.
I do, and I love it.
Sandy and I don't feel bad for you.
Don't feel bad, please don't, 'cause I love it. Question,
Yeah,
closing the door will deal with open door at the end of the month,
wait, closing the deal with open door,
Mhm.
okay.
but they put down Duluth. I don't want to close Zell County, sorry, Duluth.
You can close in any office, just tell them that you wanna close in Peachtree Corners
Yeah.
and they'll schedule it with me.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. I think they normally put that because it's processed out of our Duluth office, like our open door, we have a whole department that handles open door closings.
Right.
So they're always gonna process the file, but you can sign in any one of our offices. Just tell your contact with O'Kelly that you've been emailing with that you wanna sign here.
Just Lacey, just went binding yesterday, and then some Tyler guy or something like that, I don't want to say it, but. So you can be in our Duluth, but if you can't make Duluth, you can close anywhere, and I'm like, well, I want to go ahead and start the process now over here, so it's not like last minute, you're just showing paperwork to sit down, I'd rather.
Well, no, they're still gonna process the whole file, so it
Okay.
won't be like Nina and Lindsay working on it, it'll be the open door people like our O'Kelly people in our open door department that process it out of Duluth, but you can still come sign it with me, and that's fine,
Do you guys get credit out of that, or is it?
yeah,
Okay, so that's, okay, that's a good thing
it
to
helps
do.
me.
Okay, that's what I wanna make sure of, because it's like, if you're just sitting there going, now you're just gonna waste an hour of my time, because they get all the credit for it, then I would.
No,
I was just going to ask the same question, because that you opened the door and I was confused on why the name software, but.
Yeah, we
They have
have
a
a
standard.
department that processes it, because Open Door's so big, does so many transactions, that we have a whole section that processes it, because they have all their documents, they know how they work, and it's easier on Open Door to have it streamlined like that. Same reason that like your smaller investors want to use the same attorney every time, it's streamlined, but yeah, signing it in our office, we could get credit for that.
We'll do
I like
that.
it, I like the way you think,
You got it.
thanks, Kim.
So closing acting as holder are money. Exhibit,
Yeah, that, the F510 is an exhibit to your contract, and then the F511 I can sign, so any O'Kelly attorney can sign it, if it's closing in any O'Kelly office.
right, but like if I put your name down as the close attorney on that budget, but they reached out to someone in the open door portion of your.
That's fine.
I don't know, do I need to change?
No, so if I get one, and let's say, Tiffany is our attorney in Beaufort, if I get an N511 instead of Kelly and Sorokin and Tiffany McWhorter, I just cross it out and write Ashley Connor and sign it, like that shouldn't be a holdback at all. And if they say anything, just send it to me and I'll sign it.
Can we ask someone name?
He's the pre-close. So he's gonna print it for an attorney to sign, but it'll be, yeah, anyone in O'Kelly and Sorokin, any attorney can sign it. It doesn't matter which office they're closing or which department. Guys, well, we will go ahead and get started. For y'all that are here in person, I printed out the slides if you wanna grab a packet there so you can follow along. And then in Zoom land, I'm trying to write down everybody that is here so I can email you guys the PowerPoint after. So that way we've all got it. I think y'all all know me. I'm Ashley Connor with O'Kelly and Sorokin. Y'all know my office is right across the hall. I put my email on there, the office phone number, and then my cell phone. So I'm always happy if you guys want to call or text my cell phone, feel free to use that. If it's your clients, I do prefer that they use the office number. But y'all can always call me, text me, email me. So I'm getting a lot of questions on contingencies, what they are, how they operate, seeing a lot of earnest money losses because of contingency issues. That's really kind of what I wanted to delve into today, is going over contingencies. So what is a contingency and when do we use them? So really what a contingency is a contract provision that requires a specific event or action to take place in order for the contract to be considered valid. So what I think is one of the most important things to note about a contingency is that you have to actually add the contingency into the contract for it to be there. There's really no like automatic contingency if that language is not actually already in the agreement. And that seems like a duh thing, but I do get a lot of questions about appraisal contingencies specifically. If you don't add it in, you do not have one. It's not like Georgia law. There has to be one. So just kind of keep that in mind, no such thing as a presumed contingency. And I'm going to say this at the beginning, if y'all have any questions or thoughts, definitely raise your hand, interrupt me, whatever. I want this to be as helpful as possible for you guys. And I find the more interactive it is, the more interesting it is for all of us. So the most common contingencies and the ones that I really want to go over today are going to be the due diligence, appraisal contingencies, financing contingencies, and sale or lease of a buyer's property. So strictly speaking, due diligence is not necessarily like if this happens, then you close kind of contingency. It's really an option contract, but it's close enough that I do want to go over it in this hour segment that we've got. So that's the one that we'll go ahead and talk about first. So due diligence, this is on page 1 of y'all's purchase and sale, right? So we've all filled in the due diligence box. Again, it's an option contract, so free look at the property. And what that means is buyer is buying the option to terminate at will for a period of time, okay? So who has the leverage during due diligence?
The buyer does.
That's exactly right. Is the seller obligated to do anything that the buyer asks for?
No,
That's correct. So really the only risk to the seller is that if they don't do what the buyer's asking, the buyer can terminate and walk away with no penalty, okay? The contract does turn to an as-is contract as soon as due diligence is over. So it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to put that language in your contract. Another question on due diligence, does it matter what you put on the termination? So if you're gonna unilaterally terminate during your due diligence period, does it matter what your TNR says for the reason if the buyer can terminate for any reason whatsoever?
no,
That's not correct. So you wanna indicate that you're terminating in the due diligence period. So if you're in due diligence and you terminate and you put on the TNR that the appraisal came in low, you don't have an appraisal contingency, you didn't have a right to terminate under an appraisal contingency, your buyer's gonna lose the earnest money. So although they can terminate for any reason, you wanna indicate that it's the due diligence period that they're terminating for. That's the reason on the TNR. So just kind of be careful of that you're naming the reason that the buyer had the opportunity to terminate. And all you're doing is, it's one of the options, terminating during the due diligence period. Just check that box and then you're totally good. You don't have to list anything else. Just be careful that you don't put the wrong contingency or wrong reason on that termination. Does that make sense?
mhm,
Perfect.
That you're terminating for financial reasons.
Did someone, June, was that you talking? I could barely hear you.
I was saying maybe you cannot put that you are terminating for financial reasons.
Right, maybe your due diligence, you put a 5-day due diligence and no financing contingency. You absolutely can terminate because you got denied for the loan in those 5 days, but what you're writing on the termination is you're checking the due diligence box. You're not checking other financing contingency because you don't have a financing contingency. So you can terminate for whatever reason. It's just when you fill out the TNR, the termination and release, you want to check the due diligence box, showing that this is why your buyer had the right to terminate. Otherwise, they don't have a right to terminate. So just don't terminate under the wrong thing. Because unfortunately, I have seen that, maybe not so much with due diligence, but I've seen someone, and really, unfortunately, it's almost always gonna be the agent's fault when they put the wrong reason, because it's you guys that's filling out the termination, not necessarily your client most of the time. And I have seen it where the appraisal, came in low, but they did go through all the steps to get the seller to reduce the sales price. Lender was already denying the loan for some other reason, so they could have indicated that they were terminating due to the loan contingency, the financing contingency, but they checked the appraisal box, the other side said, you didn't do this correctly, we're gonna keep the earnest money. And they were right. You can't go back and amend your termination without the other side approving it. The other side is fine with it, of course you can, but you don't want to set your client up to lose earnest money because you put the wrong box on the termination. So I just bring that up to be careful on that front. So I guess I could have clicked over, but you see box A, buyer's right to terminate during due diligence. That's what you want to make sure that you're checking if you are terminating in that due diligence timeframe.
Hey,
And-
Ash,
Yeah.
quick question. Is it wise in due diligence is till 11:59 on the last day of due diligence unless otherwise stated? But I have taken to making due diligence end earlier than that, saying in the contract that due diligence ends at 8 p.m. or 10 p.m. or whatever. I personally do not want to wait until almost midnight. And some agents will wait until the very last minute.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I see a lot of agents saying, due diligence and contingency periods and 8 p.m. or 5 p.m. or whatever you wanna do. As long as you worded it in a way that is very clear on what you're talking about. I think if you just say all time periods, and that's not gonna make as much sense, right? But if you say due diligence ends at 8 p.m. instead of 11:59 p.m., I think that's pretty darn clear. So as long as it's clear, you're not leaving open room for interpretation or different interpretations, I think that's fine, and a lot of agents do prefer that, because you're right, it'll be like 11:32, and they send over the amendment to address concerns, and you're like, cool, I have, 27 minutes to call and wake my seller up, talk them through this after I've reviewed it, so that can happen. So I think you're fine if you wanna do that.
Thank you.
Of course. So again, once the due diligence period is over, this contract is an as-is contract. I put the actual paragraph on here, so this is part of due diligence, which is gonna be paragraph 8. So you're looking at B8, but you see it's F. And I think it's important that you see where this language is, because I know a lot of y'all have had sellers that say, I wanna see this language in there. And if you just say, oh, it's in the contract, that's not as persuasive as, oh, it's in the contract, let me show you where. So then your seller can see with their eyeballs, okay, that language is already in there, there's no need for us to write that again. If they absolutely demand that you write it again, is that okay?
Ashley, what's the question?
If they absolutely say, I see that it's already in there, I don't care, I want you to write it again, that this is an as-is contract. Is that okay for you to do that?
I mean, I wouldn't, because your language may be different than what's already written in the contract, and what's written in the contract rules.
Well, actually, if you write a special stipulation, that would rule over the language in the contract, and in most cases, I do advise to avoid rewriting things that are already in the contract to avoid changing them. But I think if you have a seller that says, I want it to say this is an as-is contract, that's one of those things I wouldn't fight them on. I would show them that it's already in there, but if they say, I don't care, I want you to write it again, it's fine to write it again. Okay, so that's an exception to my normal, don't rewrite stuff. If they're being pushy, it's not worth your time to argue with them on it. You can write it, but I do think it's really important that you explain to your sellers what that means, because I think there's a pretty big misconception with there being a special stipulation that says as to what that means. So if you have a special stip that says that, and even if you don't, it's already in there, right? So it doesn't actually change the position. But a lot of sellers think that as is means that the buyer is not allowed to ask for any changes. That's not correct. Buyer can ask for whatever they want to ask for. And if you have due diligence, like we talked about, the buyer has the leverage, right? Because they can terminate, but a seller doesn't have to agree to it. So I think it's important that you explain that if you're writing it, or if that comes up in conversation and it's persuasive when you show them where it's in the contract, still let them know like, hey, this is true. However, the buyer may still ask you for things. You have the right to not do them, but they're not doing anything wrong by asking you things. Like if they send the amendment to address concerns, there's nothing wrong with a buyer doing that. The other misconception about as is that sellers think that they don't have to disclose anything at all. Do we think that's correct, or are those sellers wrong?
No, I think legally the seller has a legal obligation to disclose any latent defects, whether it's during due diligence or after.
That's exactly correct. So a lot of sellers, again, think that this means they don't have to make any disclosures because they said it's as is. They do still have to make those disclosures that by law they have to make, which you're exactly right. It's those hidden or latent defects. So make sure your seller understands buyer can ask for things and you still have to disclose hidden defects. I think as long as you've had that conversation, then your transaction is going to be a little bit more smooth. Any questions on due diligence? Okay, so next section is going to be the appraisal contingencies. we've got the 4 different types of contingencies, so our no financing, our conventional, our FHA, and our VA appraisal contingencies. My biggest pointer on these contingencies, these appraisal contingencies, is that they're not a get out of jail free card. For pretty much all of them, you do have to give the seller the opportunity to reduce the sales price. So just keep that in mind with all 4 varieties of these appraisal contingencies. So here's my little comparison chart for you guys. Cash and conventional really work very similarly. It's just the deadline for responding is slightly different. So where you're starting at, where the appraisal needs to hit, is gonna be your purchase price. It says purchase price. There's no obligation or extra effort for you guys to make sure those 2 numbers match, because it literally just says purchase price. The buyer, if the appraisal comes in low, the buyer has to submit an amendment to change the sales price, amendment to reduce the sales price to the seller. And, well, I say has to, if they're not happy with the appraisal and they want the opportunity to terminate, they have to submit that amendment. If it comes in $100 low and the buyer says, I don't even care, you don't have to actually try to lower the price. Your buyer can still buy it at the price that they agreed to. It's just if they want the opportunity to address the low appraisal, they have to submit that amendment to reduce the sales price. There are deadlines. I don't necessarily read the boxes to you, but essentially the seller got a chunk of time to respond, and then the buyer has a chunk of time to terminate if the seller doesn't respond. Is how both of those work, okay? The only difference really is that conventional has to happen a few days before closing, whereas the cash and no financing can run right up to closing date, is the only difference. But as far as how they work, identical. Comes in low, if buyer wants to either reduce the price or terminate, they have to submit that amendment. The seller can either agree and parties close, or they don't agree and buyer can terminate as the low appraisal. The FHA and VA work a little bit different. Y'all know we've got the amendatory clause in both of those exhibits. And the amendatory clause, keep in mind, rules above all else. Okay, so you can't really write a good stipulation to override the amendatory clause. But looking at FHA, this is the only one where you're gonna actually write in the number that the appraisal has to reach. And this kind of opens the door for a lot of issues. I almost wish they would just write purchase price there, because what happens a lot is, let's say I submit an offer for the property for $300,000, then your seller counters and says, no, 330. And I say, okay, no problem. Well, did I remember to update my FHA exhibit? Probably not. So now you've got a contract where I've agreed to buy it at 330. But I have an appraisal contingency that says as long as the appraisal hits 300,000, I will buy it for 330,000. A, that's not what everybody meant from the get-go, right? That was an oversight. But B, the lender is not gonna allow that to go through. But what makes that extra tricky is that the lender can say, hey, your FHA amendatory clause amount has to match your purchase price, and they can require that to process the loan. But legally, the seller is under no obligation to sign an amendment changing that. So the seller could say, no, this is amazing for me. As long as the appraisal hits 300, you have to buy it at 330 or I get to keep your earnest money. And the seller is right. So if you represent a buyer and you have an FHA loan, it is so important that if there's a counter offer or if there's an amendment, you know, the amendment changes the sales price from 300 to 330, that same amendment should also update the amendatory clause in your FHA exhibit. Those should always be the same. And I see that get missed a lot. And it can be a real problem because if you're getting an FHA loan, you might not have $30,000 to buy that difference, right? And the lender's not gonna loan money on a property based off of an inflated value. If the appraisal is 300, that's what the lender is comfortable with. So just be careful and make sure you're updating those accordingly. They did change the FHA exhibit this year. It used to totally be a get out of jail free card. And what I mean by that is, you know, the amendatory clause in FHA and VA both run the entire length of the contract. So there's no number of days that you have to fill in. Whereas in cash and conventional, you're filling in a number of days that this contingency period lasts. But the amendatory clause is the whole contract. And it used to be that with FHA loans, if the appraisal came in low, the buyer could terminate on the morning of closing, even though the appraisal came in 3 weeks ago, right? And what we were seeing people do is buyers would be fine with the low appraised value, because maybe it was like $1,000 low. But then the seller would do something to make them angry, and they would terminate the last second. They kind of had that to whip out of their back pocket. I think the committee figured that was in fact not a good way to do business, a little bit unfair to the seller. So now they've updated it where the buyer does have to give the opportunity to the seller to reduce the sales price. They don't have a system listed in there for FHA or VA. VA's always been like that. They just updated FHA to be more similar to VA in that regard. But there's not a system, a number of days, they don't say you have to give this amendment, so it's not as clear to me, but it does say, if the seller will reduce the sales price, then parties shall close. Which means to me, the buyer has to give the seller the opportunity to reduce that sales price. So just be mindful of that, and make sure you are actually giving the opportunity to reduce the sales price if your buyer is wanting to terminate because of a low appraisal. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so is there an amount in which they have to reduce it? So let's say there's a $20,000 gap.
They're reducing it to the appraised value.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, otherwise the buyer can. So it's not like a meet in the middle kind of thing. It's all the way to the appraised value. You can't ask for lower than the appraised value, of course, but it's the appraised value.
And then on the inventory, clause in the FHA exhibit, so when people have to go back and make the amendment to change the price, is there a certain amendment form that you are able to use?
So the amendment to change the sales price is great. Yeah, you can use that. If you're gonna change a couple of things, you can just use a regular amendment and that's fine. So some common questions that I get about the appraisal contingency. The first one, if the appraisal is not back yet and my contingency is about to expire, should I go ahead and terminate? What do we think?
No, I think I would just call the lender and see what's holding it up and, see if you can get the appraisal that day.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the appraisal contingency does not give the buyer the right to terminate if the appraisal is not back yet. So if you do that, you're gonna lose your buyer the earnest money. If you get in that situation, and hopefully you won't, because really when you're filling out these exhibits, you should be calling the lender and saying, hey, how many days do you need to get the appraisal back? But if you get in a situation where you're right up against the deadline, what you should do is try to amend your appraisal contingency. Seller doesn't have to agree to it, so you might be SOL, but don't go ahead and terminate because that's guaranteeing you're gonna lose the buyer the earnest money. Another question I get is, does the appraisal contingency run from the receipt of the appraisal? What do y'all think?
Run from receipt of appraisal. I thought it ran from the date of binding agreement.
Yeah, you're correct, but I get this question a lot, so every now and then people will put 2 or 3 days in the appraisal contingency, because what they think it means is as soon as I get the appraisal, I have 2 to 3 days to decide whether I want to buy the house. But you're exactly right, that is not how it works. It's a time period that totals from binding agreement date. Remember, binding agreement date is day 0, and then you have however many days in your contingency to get the appraisal, get it back, and then send the amendment to change the sale price, if that's what you're gonna do if it's low. What about the next one? If I don't have any financing exhibit, do I still have an appraisal contingency?
You could.
How?
Yeah, you could.
How?
Without a financing exhibit, the buyer wants to make sure that they're buying a house that appraises at appraised value, separate from financing.
So what I'm getting at is, if you don't have a financing exhibit, the only way you have a appraisal contingency is if you write one into the contract.
Right.
There's not already one there. So you're right that you don't have to have the exhibit to be able to utilize that contingency. But remember, if you don't have any exhibit, you have to write that contingency in as a special stipulation. It's not inherent in the contract already. But you can totally use it. You just need to make sure you add the language. Because I get that question too. And then I sort of mentioned this, but what's the best way to write a gap stipulation for FHA or VA loans? So y'all know what a gap stipulation is? It's my buyer's willing to cover, if the appraisal comes in low, my buyer's willing to pay, up to 10,000 over appraised value, not to exceed sales price, blah, blah, blah. What's the best way to do that for FHA and VA?
Isn't that the one where the mandatory clause always takes precedent? You can write the gap stip, but it doesn't always hold. Is that the one?
That's exactly right. So kind of a trick question. The answer is you can't really write one. Now, that being said, there's nothing illegal about writing one. To your point, it's simply the fact that the amendatory clause is going to trump whatever stipulation you write. So you can say my buyer's willing to pay 10,000 over, but when the appraisal comes in low, seller's not willing to reduce it, the buyer can still walk. They are not bound to that agreement to pay 10,000 over, because the amendatory clause is going to override that special stipulation. But I do like to mention that if you have an agent on the other side, like a listing agent says, I want to see a gap stipulation, and you say, hey, it's FHA, doesn't really work like that, and they say, I don't care, I want to see it in there. Okay, fine, happy to write it as long as you understand that it's not going to hold any weight. Then ethically, you've told the other agent, hey, I'm happy to do this thing you're asking me to do, but I want you to understand it doesn't make sense. And so you've said that ethically you've done nothing wrong, but you don't want to lose the deal because the other agent doesn't know what they're doing, or maybe their seller wants to see it and they're like, listen, I know you're right. I've told my seller you're right. They just want it in there. So if you can just write it, I'd really appreciate it. Okay, fine. You can write it, just know that it's not gonna hold weight. It's kind of the important thing there. And I think it is important from an ethics perspective to tell the other side, hey, this is not gonna hold any weight.
If
But as
I
long
were-
as you can write it.
if I were the buyer's agent though, I mean, it seems to me like that's setting them up with, under false pretenses that they've got this gap stipulation, then both agents know it's not gonna hold water because of the amendatory clause. Even though the buyer wants it, to me, it seems unethical to put it in there, because now you're setting up the buyer to believe that they've got this gap stipulation, but they don't.
Well, I think it's more unethical from like the seller perspective. It only hurts the buyer, it helps the seller, right? Because the buyer would have to come out of pocket. And I agree that it's unethical as long as you and the other agent don't have a conversation about it. But if you represent the buyer and you said, okay, buyer, seller wants to see this stipulation, we're gonna write it in there. I know your intent is to pay the 10,000 over. You understand the contract's not gonna force you to do that. And then you have the conversation with the other agent. Hey, you know that this is not going to hold water over the amendatory clause, right? Like we're writing in there, it might be to show our intent, but it's gonna have no legal significance. It's the other agent's job to tell that to their seller, not yours. So as long as you and that other agent have had that discussion, I think ethically you are fine. If that agent doesn't tell that seller, then that agent might have an ethics issue. And it might be good to do it over email, right? So if there's a complaint filed, you could say, no, we had this discussion, they wanted it in there. I said it's not gonna make sense, but I'm happy to write it if it makes them happy. You've done everything above board. But you're not gonna lose the deal because the other agent wants to see language that everybody understands doesn't make sense. Just like as is, you're not going to, have a full-on fight with your seller because they want to see the words as is in the contract again. You're gonna write it and it's fine. But totally agree that ethically, if you don't say anything, so like if you represent the buyer and you know your buyer's using a VA loan, and you write that stipulation in the offer and send it off and don't say anything, I agree that that is unethical.
Yeah. I mean, these are government-backed loans. The government's going to dictate what is and is not going to work on in these clauses, not the agents or
Right.
our GAR firms.
Right, which is why the forms say that the amendatory clause trumps all else, because at the very base of things for both FHA, traditionally that's for people who are having a little bit harder time qualifying for a loan, and not always, but that's kind of why that originated, right, is to help more people get into homes. And then VA is certainly to protect and give back to our military who've given us so much, is to protect those people. And so to protect them, you don't want them to buy a house for a higher dollar amount than its actual value. So that's sort of the theory behind it. That's gonna end up winning out. So you're right that we don't get to really change what the amendatory clause says. I just think from an ethics perspective and then from like an ease of transaction perspective, you're okay to put that language in there as long as you follow those steps and everybody understands what's going on. Any other questions on appraisals? So our financing contingencies, we've got conventional, FHA, and VA. So most of these forms, the first few paragraphs are identical across the three. Or get to the same idea, you might have different paragraphs, number of different things, because something's missing, but overall, the idea of these three for the first chunk of the form are all the same. So essentially what you're doing in the financing contingency is the buyer's choosing the number of days to determine whether they qualify for the loan, and who gives us that number to plug in on the exhibit.
The lender.
Exactly right. And then prior to the expiration of that time period, the buyer can terminate because they were not approved for the loan. So they were denied for the loan, okay? You have to send in the termination to the other side within the time frame of your contingency. And then within 7 days of sending notice, of sending the termination, you have to also provide the denial letter. And this is honestly where I'm seeing the most issues with losing earnest money, is with this exact scenario, is with the financing contingency. Because everybody understands that you have to terminate in however many days you set up in that window. So many people are forgetting to send over the loan denial letter. So if you don't do that, the seller's getting the earnest money. And a lot of times it's the agent sending the notice, right? You get your client to sign it, you're depending on your client to say, hey, I'm getting denied for the loan. But as far as actually sending it over, a lot of times it's the agent hitting send on the email. So make sure you've got both the termination and the loan denial letter, either together or in a 7-day time period. Someone have a
This
question?
one is where? Or is it just one key? Oh, okay.
You have a question, Sharon?
Oh, okay. Okay, great. All right, thank you. Sounds good. Thanks, Tony. I appreciate it. Would you like a
Sharon,
seltzer
can you
water
mute
to take on the
yourself,
road?
please?
Sure. Okay, thank you. You too. Bye.
So anyway, make sure you're actually sending over that loan denial letter. So if you're the listing agent and you get a TNR and it says terminating for financing contingency, should you go ahead and have your seller sign it?
Sorry, Ashley, can you repeat the question again? Sorry.
If you're the listing agent and the other agent sends over a TNR that says they're terminating under the financing contingency, should you go ahead, and they're within the window, should you go ahead and have your seller sign that?
Well, doesn't it depend on whether or not the lender that's denied them is the lender that's on the financing contingency?
So that's part of it, but the first kind of roadblock there is don't have them sign it until you actually get the loan denied. Because that's the second half of it, is they gotta provide it within 7 days from turning in the notice that they're terminating, okay? And keep in mind, it's 7 days from when they delivered notice, not 7 days from the end of the financing contingency period. So what I mean by that is, let's say you have 10 days for your financing contingency. You terminate on day 6, your 7 days start tolling on day 7. That's day 1, right? Not day 11. So not after the entire contingency expires, it's after you send the notice to terminate. That's when those 7 days start to run. So you get the termination as a listing agent, hey, we're terminating under the financing contingency. You say, hey, thanks so much for sending. Don't forget to send me the loan denial letter. Or you say nothing because you want your seller to keep the earnest money and they never send the loan denial letter and your seller gets earnest. But I wouldn't just go ahead and have them sign it because then you've lost the opportunity for them to maybe have that actual earnest money come to them. The second part of that, and more to your point, Sharon, is the loan denial letter. So once, the step one is actually getting it. Step two is reviewing it. Does it match everything that's on the first page of the contract? So you're also calling your lender to fill in these boxes. You don't want to guess at that. You want the lender. They're the ones that are the experts on the matter, right? They're the ones that have talked to the client. They're the ones that know all of these terms. Call your loan officer, your client's loan officer, get them to help you fill this part out. Whatever's on the loan denial letter needs to match what this language says. And what happens sometimes is a buyer might say, okay, I'm gonna put down 15%. So I'm gonna get an 85% loan. And then talking to the lender, they have more money. They decide they're actually gonna be better off if they put 20% down. So it's an 80% loan. That's totally fine. The exhibit says that you can change your loan. You have to stay within the type of loan, so you can't switch like conventional to FHA. If you're conventional, you gotta stay conventional, but you can switch from an 85% loan to an 80% loan. That is totally fine. However, if they get denied for the 80% loan and your exhibit says 85%, you need to make sure they're denied for the 85% loan. Okay, so as soon as, if you represent the buyer, as soon as they say, hey, I'm getting denied for the loan, you hang up and immediately call the loan officer. Like waste 0 minutes, you call the loan officer and you say, hey, I heard you're denying Timmy for the loan. I want to make sure that we're on the same page with what that loan denial letter is going to say so that we don't lose Timmy his earnest money. Your loan officer is not going to be the one who's writing the letter. So if the letter doesn't match, I wouldn't call screaming at the loan officer. But what they can do is make sure their system reflects what's on your form, right? They can coordinate with the team who writes the denial letter to make sure that everything matches up. So make sure you take that step because your buyer's not going to remember that this is what this says. And it's not necessarily your job to make sure that nothing goes wrong, but you are protecting the earnest money. You are the one who knows what these forms say. So they're looking to you for guidance on how to proceed. So I think that's important that you touch base with the loan officer to make sure all the terms in those boxes match. As far as the approved mortgage lender, the list right there, if there is someone listed, the letter needs to come from one of the listed companies. What if there's nobody listed? This is blank, just like it is there. Then you can send in the denial letter.
If there's no one listed and they get denied, they just have the denial letter from the lender they've chosen, I understand suffices. But if they change lenders and the financing contingency shows ABC mortgage company and their loan denial letters from XYZ, then it doesn't work.
That's correct. So the answer is if there's nobody there, it can come from any institutional lender. And that is an important word to keep in mind. So like if they didn't put anybody and then they decide they're gonna go get a hard money loan, you can't take a loan denial letter from a hard money lender. Okay, it's gotta be an institutional lender, a real lender. Almost every lender that you've dealt with is gonna fall in that box. But just know that it does have to be an institutional lender. But yeah, so if you represent a buyer, you want to leave those lines blank, right? To keep your buyer's options open. If you represent a seller, you want to see the lender that you trust listed there, right? Because they can use whoever, but if they're saying, I'm using some lender that you guys have never heard of, you're like, I don't know that I trust them. I don't know that I'm comfortable with them. I want this exhibit to say Onward, because I know the people who work with Onward. I know that if they're going to deny this person, it's because they really can't get the loan. It's not because they're sketchy. So get it with whoever you want, but at the end of the day, if you can't get it, you got to run it through my people first. You can do that, and it's fine. Or you say, but look, you can do that. As the listing agent, you want to see at least one name there. As a buyer's agent, you want to try to leave it blank. for that reason, okay? Again, you don't have to close with the same terms, it's just making sure that if they're denied, the letter has those terms. So again, this is where that language is in the actual contract. So it's in paragraph F for financing contingency. Notifies seller and then has the 7 days. So that's the part that gets mixed. And the loan denial letter has to come from one of the required lenders in the exhibit. So this is where those, all three forms are a little bit different as far as conventional, FHA, and VA. Not a ton different, but they all have this same idea in that the loan denial letter cannot be based solely off of one of these reasons. So if it's a legitimate reason and an illegitimate reason, that's fine. As long as you have at least one legitimate reason on your loan denial letter, you're good for that part of it, okay? But if it only lists one of these, then it's not a legitimate letter. So again, if you represent the seller, you get the loan denial letter, you see all the terms match, you see that it's the lender that's listed, or if there's no listed lender, it's an institutional lender that you've heard of. Then you look to see, okay, why are they getting denied? What is actually listed as the reason? And if it's one of these, and it's only one of these, then you can say, nope, my seller keeps the earnest money. That's not a legitimate reason. And so what I did is beside each one, I put which type of loan it's part of. And so like E, the property not appraising for at least the purchase price unless there's an appraisal contingency. You can't have that on your conventional loans. It's not included in FHA or VA because the appraisal contingency or the amendatory clause runs the entire length of the contract. So they just didn't include it. So that's kind of how I showed what's included on what. That's really kind of the only one that's not on all of them. So just pay attention to that. And also when you're calling the loan officer representing the buyer, it's, hey, what's the reason they're getting denied? And if they say, oh, they're getting denied because they went out and bought a Maserati yesterday and they can't afford it. Well, just know that you're probably not gonna get that earnest money. You can still fill it out the TNR and try to get the other side to sign it. But if they say, we need to see the loan denial letter and it says, bought a Maserati, the listing agent's gonna say, no, my guy's keeping the money. And they would be right. So have that conversation with the lender, because maybe there is also a legitimate reason that they can put on there instead. So this is kind of, again, the language in the contract backing up what we just talked about. The other important thing on these contingencies, these loan contingencies, is that it gives the seller some rights that are pretty important. And that's why it's good, even from a listing perspective, to utilize these forms instead of just trying to like write your own little contingencies, because then you might be taking away rights from the seller that you really do actually want to have. So the intent to proceed. Note that the buyer is actually obligated to provide the seller with the lender contact that they're actually going to move forward with. That's important because you as the listing agent want to be able to call that lender and verify where you are in the process. So this intent to proceed creates that obligation, gives the seller that information, gives you as a listing agent that information to be following up and making sure everything is going well. After the financing contingency expires, then the seller can request that the buyer show their ability to close, okay? And so that typically is gonna be a commitment letter. It's not necessarily promising that they will in fact be able to close. It's just saying my contingency is expired and here's a commitment letter from the mortgage lender. If the buyer does not provide that, then the seller can actually terminate. So this is a right that almost nobody pays attention to, but it does exist. So again, a good reason to have those exhibits. So you do give your seller the opportunity to request this proof of ability to close and then the opportunity to terminate if it's not provided.
So you actually contingency, financing contingency period has expired, correctly, do not provide. And you will settle the covenant.
Correct. And there's timeframes that got listed out there, so you have to be within the timeframes, but big picture wise, that's exactly right.
Ashley, that seller request, the written evidence of buyer's ability to purchase the property, what, is that an email from the buyer's agent? And what is that? What does that?
So
mean?
it's gonna be a loan commitment stating the type, the amount, the terms, and then the conditions for funding the loan. So really, at the end of the day, it's a loan commitment. It's not a guarantee that they're gonna be able to close, but it's one more piece of evidence, if you will, that they're on the right track. It's, hey, your contingency is gone, so if you were gonna get denied, hopefully that would have already happened. Let's get that commitment letter.
Okay.
So it's good to explain to your sellers, like, even if we get this, it's not 100% guaranteed kind of thing, but it at least is further evidence and shows that everybody's working on it. And then another really important one is this authorization to release. A lot of people forget about this one as well. This is what authorizes the lender to speak to the seller and the listing agent about how the file is going. So if you are ever dealing with a loan officer who says, oh, you know, Mr. Listing Agent, I can't share that with you at all, you say, well, actually, here's the authorization. They've signed the exhibit, just send the financing exhibit, point this paragraph out. I took off the numbers because it's numbered differently depending on which loan contingency you're looking at. But it does give you the right to get updates on the loan, see how it's going. Maybe not personal information for the buyer, but just, are we clear to close? Are we gonna close on time? Have they turned in everything they're supposed to turn in? That kind of thing. Also, what gives you the right to call, like, you get the loan denial letter and you're not quite sure what the reasoning is, you call the lender and say, what do you mean by this? Lender can tell you why they were denying for the loan. And that'll help make the decision on whether you want your seller to sign the TNR or not. Questions on loan contingencies?
Sorry.
And then the last one that I wanted to go through was the sale or lease of buyer's property contingency. So we use this when your buyer has to sell or lease another property in order to be able to purchase this next property. This contingency pretty much went away during COVID, and then maybe last year it started kind of resurging as something that people use, because a lot of people just straight up cannot afford to buy one house without selling their other one. So it makes sense to set up some sort of contingency for this. So, of course, the first thing you want to do is to go ahead and define that property. So in paragraph 1, buyer warrants that they own the property located at whatever that they have to actually sell or lease before moving on. So you're just defining the property, getting everyone on the same page on that front. And then this really starts to get into the meat of this. So at the time of the offer, so your buyer's sending in an offer, they're warranting that the property is either listed, under contract, or other. So know where you stand. Probably, you know, if you're dealing with a property in another state, probably good for you to have a relationship with that agent, right? If they're both in Georgia, you might be handling both sides, you might know the answer to this. But make sure you're actually picking one of these and that it's accurate. And then the agreement is contingent upon one of the following occurring on or before, and you're filling in a date. So either closing the property or leasing the property. If you forget to check one of these boxes, it could end up being a really big deal, because it could be that there's no meeting of the minds. If you have a contract, you have to have a meeting of the minds. So that doesn't exist. A judge could say your entire contract is void because it's the material term that nobody agreed upon. So it's easy to miss a checkbox, but just pay attention and make sure you actually check one of those boxes. As far as 3A, buyer closing on the sale of the other property, notice that it says buyer shall keep the other property listed for sale at a list price of not more than, and fill that in. The reason they have not more than is because you don't want your buyer to say, okay, I've got a $300,000 house that I'm gonna sell, but I actually really just wanna get out of this purchase contract, so I'm gonna go ahead and list my house for 1.1 million. Knowing darn well, exactly 0 people are gonna offer. So you cap it, so they can't use that as a way to scurry out of the contract. The last sentence on there, nothing herein shall give the buyer an ability to terminate the agreement if the property sells for an amount greater than the list price. This was always true, it was an addition to the forms, I think it was this year, because what was happening is sellers were saying, okay, I've got this $300,000 house, I'm gonna come get this $400,000 house using the proceeds. Well, then for 300,000, there were bidding wars and they actually sold it for 420. And they're like, well, hey, I got 420 for this. I don't want your skimpy $400,000 house anymore. I'm gonna go find something nicer. And they were trying to terminate. They never could, but this sentence was added because apparently it was happening so much that it was widespread confusion. So they just clarified that. Know that you can't do that with this contingency. It's really set up to say, I need to sell this other house before I buy. This is one. As far as choosing the contingency period, I think it's really important. So what I'm talking about is up here in 3, on or before, and you're filling in the date, okay? Know that if that contingency period comes and goes without the activity you selected occurring, your contract automatically terminates. Doesn't give someone the right to terminate, it automatically terminates. So what you don't want to do is make it so short that you're setting up your contract to automatically terminate, okay? Your seller might not want to give the buyer the entire length of their contract, and that's fine. It's just a decision on, you know, what parties think is best. Just keep in mind that it does automatically terminate, and you don't wanna not know that that's happening and then be out of contract. Okay, there's no I changed my mind clause. So a lot of people think that's a thing where if the buyer, when they're selling their other house, they decide they actually don't want to sell it anymore, that's not grounds for them to terminate this contract, okay? You can't just willy-nilly up and change your mind and call it a day. You have to actually be diligently attempting to complete the sale the whole time for that contingency. So this happens quite a bit. What happens if the other one terminates? So the buyer's sale, and I say quite a bit, maybe quite a bit is wrong, but this can happen. So if that does terminate, then the buyer has to provide notice to the seller, hey, my house that was under contract has terminated. The buyer can terminate at the same time. So they're sending the termination to the seller saying, hey, my other file terminated, I'm terminating this one. If they do not terminate, then the seller can request an amendment removing all the contingencies within the 3 days. If they don't do it 3 days, then that's waived. And then the seller does have the right to terminate if the buyer doesn't respond in 3 days. So for this, everything is a 3-day time period, but just keep in mind, if your buyer's sale terminates, you have to immediately provide notice to your buyer's seller. And then if your buyer wants to terminate, because they cannot buy this house without selling this one, they need to do that at the same time, they're given notice. So for a kick-out clause, what a kick-out clause is, and this is on that same contingency form, it means that the seller can go ahead and keep marketing the property. If they get another offer that they want to accept, then they provide the notice to the first buyer. The first buyer can either remove the contingencies that were laid out in that kick-out clause. If the buyer does that, the rest of the contract remains as is. If the buyer does not do that, then the seller can terminate first buyer contract and go under contract with the second buyer. So what that looks like is right here. So first off, you're choosing whether, option 1, there is a kick-out clause, option 2, there is no kick-out clause. If you choose option 1, saying there is a kick-out clause, you're deciding whether you want all contingencies and due diligence to be included, or you're selecting specific ones. As the seller, you want to check A, right? You want to be able to get rid of everything. As the buyer, you probably just wanna check, the sale or lease of buyer's property contingency. Or whatever ones, everything is a negotiation, so finding a happy medium there, but obviously, seller wants to get rid of all of them, buyer wants to minimize that, okay? And this is the one that gets people, upset a lot. So what happens if the buyer says, I'm gonna list my home for this price, they do list it for that price, and it just never goes under contract, so they're not gonna close. And we know 14 days out, if I'm not under contract now, I'm probably not gonna be able to close. Then what do? Do you just sit there and wait? Buyer does not have the right to terminate because the contingency period hasn't ended. Seller doesn't have the right to terminate, again, because the contingency period hasn't ended. So pretty much everybody's stuck, unless both sides agree that they want to terminate. Don't forget, there's a mutual termination. So this is a great spot to use a mutual termination is, hey, I'm just not gonna get this under contract. I don't know what's going on. I'm really sorry. We can wait and then I'll terminate once, it'll automatically terminate once it expires. Or if you wanna go ahead and get it back on the market, I'm gonna go ahead and look at other houses. Let's just mutually terminate, but neither side can unilaterally terminate. So be careful with that. Questions for me?
I have a question.
Okay.
So if the buyer has a home to sell and that home goes under contract, but the seller of the house they're trying to buy gets a better offer. And so can they invoke the kick out to take a better
If
offer?
you made that part of your contract. So in paragraph 7, if you picked option 1, then yes, that's exactly what they would do. If you picked option 2, then they don't have the right to do that.
So if they do that, if they invoke that right, and you've got this house under contract that you're currently in, what happens to that transaction? As the seller of your current house, you've got a new buyer under contract.
So this is talking about your buyer's purchase. This doesn't affect your buyer's sale at all. So it doesn't change the contract at all.
What is needed to protect the buyer's sale?
Well, the buyer's sale is not, it's not really relevant to this document. So the buyer's sale, they're either gonna sell it for the terms of their contract or they're not. All this is saying is if on their purchase, if that seller gets an offer that they like more, if they've included the kick out clause, they can say, hey, buyer, get rid of these contingencies and we're gonna proceed to close. Or if you don't wanna get rid of these contingencies, we're gonna terminate. But that doesn't affect the first closing at all. The only thing that affects is then your buyer could then be homeless, right? Because they're still selling the house and they don't have a new house. But there's really nothing you do on the purchase contract is going to affect your sale contract. It's just the other way. If you don't sell, then you can't buy.
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to think outside of the sale, protecting the buyer from being homeless. And I understand that that's a not part of this contract, but.
So, yeah, there's not really, I don't think there's any language, I mean, you could put language in there that's like a reverse sale or lease contingency, like a purchase or lease contingency in your sale contract that basically says, if they don't find another house to buy and close on that house within X amount of days, this sale contract terminates, but there's not like a form for that. You would have to come up with that language and add it into your contract, and I think as a seller, that's probably not, or as a buyer, that's probably gonna be a scary thing to see in the contract.
Got it.
So I'm not saying you can't do it, but that would be really the only only way to do that is to offer protection on their sale contract.
Ashley, if the contract, your seller did not include a kickout clause and the buyer's property is under contract, so they're now under contract to buy the seller's property. And there is no kickout clause, but the seller gets a better offer. Would the best option be just to take a backup offer since there is
Yes.
no kickout clause?
Yes, because the seller, if there's no kickout clause, the seller has no right to terminate the contract. They would be in breach and the buyer could sue them. But you can absolutely take a backup offer, and that way if it automatically terminates or something goes wrong, then you're ready to go. I think that's a perfect solution.
Okay.
Any other questions for me? All right. Well, I think I'm gonna try to write everyone down so I can send you guys the PowerPoint. Who is iPhone?
Me.
But who is me?
Yeah, I don't know who that is.
So if you are iPhone and you want a copy of the presentation, send me an email and I will be happy to get it to you. Unless anybody's got any other questions, that is all I have, and I appreciate y'all being here.
Thank you, Ashley. This was great.
Good, I'm so glad it was helpful.
Yes, very much. Thank you. Bye,
You're
everyone.
welcome.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.